Some nights aren't meant to celebrate success, they're designed to expose who never deserved it in the first place. The ballroom of the Grand Meridian Hotel shimmered under cascading crystal chandeliers, each one casting fractured light across polished marble floors that reflected a world built on power, money, and carefully curated illusions. Waiters moved like clockwork, balancing trays of champagne flutes that caught the golden glow, while a low hum of conversation, measured, polished, strategic, filled the air. This was not just an awards night. It was a stage. And Ethan Cole stood at the center of it like a man who believed he owned the spotlight. His tuxedo fit like it had been tailored to his ego, sharp lines, perfect cut, every inch of him projecting control. At his side, Vanessa Blake leaned into him, her hand resting lightly on his arm, her diamond bracelet catching the light with every subtle movement. It wasn't just jewelry. It was a message. A message that didn't go unnoticed by the few who remembered. Because that bracelet, it used to belong to Clara Hayes. Ethan's ex-wife. A ghost he had buried beneath headlines and quiet legal settlements. Smile, Vanessa whispered, her lips barely moving as photographers angled for the perfect shot. Ethan smirked, adjusting his cufflinks as flashes exploded in rapid succession. They're already watching, he replied under his breath, his voice smooth, practiced. Let them see what winning looks like. Across the room, names floated through conversations like currency, investors, acquisitions, expansions, but every so often, quieter voices circled back to one name that wasn't on the guest list. Clara. The woman who had once stood beside Ethan when Cole Group was nothing more than a risky idea scribbled across late-night notebooks. The woman who had disappeared the moment the empire became real. Did you hear she moved out of state? I heard she couldn't keep up. Some people just aren't built for this level. The words drifted through the air, soft but sharp, like blades wrapped in silk. Ethan heard them. And he let them linger. Because tonight, he had something planned. The orchestra softened as the event coordinator signaled from the side of the stage. It was almost time. Ethan glanced toward the podium, already imagining the applause, the recognition, the final confirmation that he had rewritten the narrative exactly how he wanted. Beside him, Vanessa adjusted her posture, tilting her chin just enough to catch the light. She wasn't just his partner tonight. She was proof of his upgrade. New. Polished. Unquestionably visible. And then, just as Ethan began to step forward, just as the room subtly shifted its attention toward him, the grand entrance doors opened. Not loudly. Not dramatically. Just enough. A quiet interruption. A ripple, barely noticeable at first. A few heads turned. Then a few more. The kind of movement that starts small before it spreads, like a realization no one can quite name yet. Ethan didn't turn immediately. He didn't need to. Not yet. Because in his world, nothing happened unless it was meant for him. But somewhere, deep beneath the layers of confidence and control, something unfamiliar flickered. Not fear. Not doubt. Just awareness. The kind that comes right before everything changes. He adjusted his stance, preparing to speak, his voice ready, his narrative set. He had no idea that tonight wasn't his stage anymore. The ripple at the entrance did not announce itself with noise, but with silence, the kind that moves through a room before anyone understands why, and one by one, conversations thinned, champagne glasses paused midair, and attention shifted not toward the stage where Ethan Cole stood ready to claim his moment, but toward the woman who had just stepped inside as if she had never left this world at all. Clara Hayes did not rush, did not hesitate, did not acknowledge the sudden gravity she had introduced into the room, her heels moving in steady, measured steps across the marble floor, each one quiet but undeniable, like a metronome resetting the rhythm of the night. Her dress was not loud, not designed to compete with the glittering gowns surrounding her, but it held its own authority, a deep midnight shade that absorbed the golden light instead of reflecting it, clean lines, tailored perfectly, the kind of elegance that did not ask for attention because it already owned it. Her hair fell in soft waves over her shoulders, her makeup understated, her expression unreadable, and yet there was something unmistakably different about her, something that made people look twice, then a third time, as if trying to reconcile the memory of who she had been with the presence of who she was now. Near the bar, a woman leaned closer to her companion, her voice lowered but not enough to escape notice. "Is that Clara Hayes?" The man beside her frowned slightly, studying her. "No, it cannot be. She would not come back here." But she had. And she did not stop. She moved past clusters of guests who instinctively shifted to give her space, their curiosity barely concealed, their whispers threading through the air like static. At the edge of the stage, Ethan finally turned. It was not immediate recognition that struck him, but something subtler, a pause, a fraction of a second where his confidence did not quite land the way it usually did. His eyes found her, and for a moment, everything else blurred. Clara. The name did not leave his lips, but it settled heavily in his chest, unfamiliar in a place where he had rewritten the past so carefully. Beside him, Vanessa followed his gaze, her grip on his arm tightening just slightly. "Who is that?" she asked, though the answer was already forming in the tension she could feel in his body. Ethan exhaled softly, a quiet scoff slipping into his expression as he straightened his shoulders. "No one," he said, too quickly, his tone dismissive, practiced. "Just someone who does not belong here." But the room was no longer listening to him. Clara reached the front rows, where reserved seating lined the space closest to the stage, and without a word, without hesitation, she took her seat among names that carried weight, influence, decision. No one stopped her. No one questioned her. A staff member approached, hesitated, then simply nodded and stepped away. It was not permission she had been given. It was recognition. Ethan watched it all unfold, something sharp pressing against the edges of his composure. This was not how it was supposed to go. He had planned the narrative, controlled the setting, ensured that tonight would reinforce exactly what he wanted the world to believe. That she was gone. That she had faded. That she had been left behind. And yet here she was, not asking to be seen, not demanding attention, but drawing it in anyway, effortlessly, dangerously. The coordinator signaled again from the side of the stage, a subtle reminder that the program was moving forward. Ethan forced a smile, stepping up to the microphone, his reflection catching briefly in the polished surface beneath him. Perfect. Untouchable. In control. He adjusted the microphone, his voice steady as it carried across the room. "Tonight is about recognizing excellence," he began, the words smooth, familiar, rehearsed. "About celebrating those who understand what it takes to rise above, to build something lasting, to not fall behind when the pressure demands more." His gaze drifted, almost involuntarily, toward Clara. She did not react. Did not flinch. Did not look away. She simply sat there, composed, her hands resting lightly in her lap, as if his words were not aimed at her at all. And that, more than anything, unsettled him. Because for the first time, Ethan Cole was speaking to a room he no longer fully controlled, and somewhere beneath the applause that followed, beneath the polished surface of success he had built so carefully, a quiet realization began to take shape. She had not come back to be seen. She had come back for something else. The applause came first, polite and expected, a smooth wave of approval that rolled through the ballroom as Ethan stepped back from the microphone, but it did not last, because just as the sound began to settle, the master of ceremonies returned to the stage with a different energy, a subtle shift that most would not notice unless they were paying very close attention, and Clara was paying attention, her gaze steady, her breathing even, as if she had been waiting for this exact moment to arrive. "Before we continue," the host said, adjusting the cards in his hand, his voice carrying clearly through the room, "we would like to acknowledge a very important development that has made tonight's event possible." A murmur rippled across the crowd, curiosity tightening the air. Ethan paused near the edge of the stage, his expression composed but his eyes narrowing slightly, calculating, measuring. This was not part of his program. The host continued, earlier this evening, a major acquisition was finalized, one that will significantly reshape the future of Cole Group and several of its affiliated ventures. That was when the silence changed, no longer casual, no longer curious, but heavy, expectant. Ethan's posture stiffened almost imperceptibly. Vanessa shifted beside him, her fingers tightening around his arm again. "What is he talking about?" she whispered, her voice no longer as steady as before. Ethan did not answer. He was listening now. Fully. "The acquiring firm," the host said, glancing down briefly before lifting his eyes back to the audience, "is Reed Global Holdings." The name landed like a quiet detonation, not loud, but undeniable, the kind of name that did not need explanation in rooms like this. Conversation stopped completely. A few heads turned instinctively toward the front rows, toward the section reserved for those who did not attend events unless they were shaping them. Ethan felt it then, a tightening in his chest that had nothing to do with nerves and everything to do with something slipping beyond his control. Reed Global Holdings did not acquire companies casually. They absorbed them. Restructured them. Owned them. Representing Reed Global Holdings tonight, the host continued, his voice now carrying a note of respect that had not been present before, is the principal investor behind this acquisition. A pause. Not accidental. Intentional. Designed. And then, without raising her voice, without looking around for permission, Clara Hayes stood. It was not dramatic. It did not need to be. The movement alone was enough. Every eye in the room found her at once, as if they had been waiting for confirmation of something they already felt but could not yet name. Ethan's breath caught, just for a second, his carefully constructed composure cracking in a way no one would notice unless they knew him well. Vanessa did not speak this time. She only stared. Clara smoothed her dress lightly, a small, almost absent gesture, before stepping forward into the light, her posture straight, her expression calm, her presence undeniable. She did not look at Ethan. Not yet. The host gestured toward her with open respect. Ms. Hayes has been instrumental in securing this transition and will be taking an active leadership role moving forward. The words settled into the room like a verdict. Not loud. Not aggressive. Final. Ethan blinked, once, as if his mind needed a moment to catch up with what his eyes were already seeing. "That is not possible," he said under his breath, though no one was listening to him anymore. Clara reached the edge of the stage, and only then did she lift her gaze to meet his. There was no anger there. No bitterness. No need to prove anything. Just clarity. The kind that comes from rebuilding something in silence and knowing exactly what it is worth. "You built a company," she said softly, her voice carrying just enough to reach him, steady and controlled, "but you never understood. Who was holding it together?" Ethan's mouth parted slightly, but no words followed. Behind her, a man stepped into view, tall, composed, unmistakably powerful in the quiet way that did not require introduction. Alexander Reed did not speak. He did not need to. His presence alone confirmed everything. Clara did not turn toward him. She did not need his validation. She had already taken her place. Around them, the room shifted again, not in whispers this time, but in something heavier, something closer to recognition. The narrative had changed. Completely. And Ethan Cole, standing under the same lights he had once controlled, realized too late that this stage had never belonged to him at all. The silence did not break all at once, it fractured slowly, like glass under pressure, small whispers forming at the edges of the room before spreading into something undeniable, something that no longer belonged to Ethan Cole, because the moment Clara Hayes stepped fully into the light, the axis of the night shifted, and everyone felt it, even those who did not yet understand why. Ethan remained where he stood, the stage beneath his polished shoes suddenly unfamiliar, as if it had tilted in a way only he could feel, his mind racing to catch up with a reality that refused to align with the version he had spent years constructing. "You are saying she owns it?" Vanessa's voice was barely audible, tight with disbelief, her eyes fixed on Clara as if staring long enough might undo what had just been revealed. Ethan did not respond immediately, because there was no clean answer, no simple correction he could offer that would restore the balance he had just lost. Instead, he watched as Clara moved with quiet certainty, not toward him, but past him, stepping onto the stage as though she had always belonged there, her presence neither aggressive nor apologetic, just exact. The host stepped aside instinctively, surrendering the space without hesitation, and for a moment, the entire ballroom seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see what she would do next. Clara did not reach for the microphone right away. She let the silence settle, let the weight of the moment expand, her gaze moving across the room, not searching for approval, not seeking validation, but acknowledging the shift that had already taken place. When she finally spoke, her voice was calm, measured, the kind of tone that did not need to rise to command attention. 5 years ago, she began, each word precise, this company was built on long nights, uncertain decisions, and a partnership that was never meant to be temporary. A few heads lowered, others leaned forward, drawn in despite themselves. Ethan's jaw tightened slightly, the memory pressing against him in ways he could not ignore. Clara continued, her expression unchanged. But somewhere along the way, the definition of value changed. Contribution became invisible. Loyalty became replaceable. And silence, she paused, just long enough for the room to lean into the space she created, was mistaken for weakness. The words did not accuse. They did not need to. They landed exactly where they were meant to. Vanessa shifted uncomfortably, her confidence no longer as polished as it had been when the cameras were flashing. Ethan took a step forward, not fully interrupting, but enough to remind himself that he was still standing there, still part of this moment, even if it was no longer his. Clara turned her head slightly, meeting his movement without reacting to it, her gaze steady, almost distant, as if she were observing something that no longer held power over her. "Tonight is not about taking anything away," she said, her voice softer now, but somehow more definitive, "it is about returning what was never meant to be lost." The room absorbed the statement in silence, the kind that follows truth when it does not need to be explained. Behind her, Alexander Reed remained still, his presence a quiet confirmation of scale, of reach, of a world far larger than the one Ethan had tried to control. But it was clear to everyone watching that this moment did not belong to him. It belonged to her. Ethan exhaled slowly, the sound barely noticeable, but heavy with the realization that the narrative he had curated so carefully had unraveled in a matter of minutes, not through confrontation, not through chaos, but through something far more unsettling. Control. Clara did not raise her voice. She did not demand recognition. She simply stood there, and the room adjusted around her. The awards, the speeches, the carefully planned sequence of the evening, all of it now felt secondary, almost irrelevant, because the true event had already happened. And as Clara stepped back slightly, not retreating, but concluding, the applause that followed was different from before. It was not polite. It was not automatic. It was real. And for the first time that night, Ethan Cole understood something he had never accounted for. She had not come back to compete. She had come back already complete. The applause lingered longer than expected, not because it was loud, but because it carried weight, the kind that settles into a room and reshapes it quietly, and as it faded, people did not immediately return to their conversations, they stayed where they were, watching, recalibrating, as if the hierarchy they had understood just an hour ago no longer applied in the same way. Clara stepped away from the center of the stage without ceremony, her movement unhurried, her expression unchanged, and yet every step she took seemed to leave a subtle imprint, as if the room itself adjusted to accommodate her presence rather than the other way around. Ethan remained still for a moment longer than he should have, his instincts pulling him forward, his pride urging him to reclaim something, anything, but there was no clear path to do that, not anymore. Vanessa leaned closer, her voice tight, controlled, but no longer confident. "Say something," she whispered. "You cannot just stand there." Ethan's jaw flexed slightly, his eyes following Clara as she descended from the stage, as she returned not to the shadows, but to a position of quiet command among the very people who had once overlooked her. "This is not over," he muttered, more to himself than to anyone else, though the certainty in his voice had thinned. He stepped down from the stage, each movement deliberate, each breath measured. As he crossed the floor toward her, the distance between them suddenly longer than it had ever been before, not in steps, but in everything that now separated them. Conversations parted as he approached, not out of respect, but out of anticipation, the kind that gathers before a moment no one wants to miss. Clara sensed him before she saw him, the shift in the air subtle but familiar, and when she turned, it was without hesitation, without tension, as if she had already decided what this moment would be. They stood facing each other, not close enough to touch, not far enough to ignore, the space between them filled with everything that had once been spoken and everything that no longer needed to be. Ethan searched her face, looking for something he recognized, something he could use, a trace of the woman he believed he had left behind, but there was nothing there that fit the version he remembered. "You planned this," he said finally, his voice low, controlled, but edged with something sharper beneath. Clara tilted her head slightly, considering him, not dismissively, but without urgency. "No," she replied, her tone even, "I prepared." The distinction landed harder than accusation. Ethan let out a quiet breath, his gaze flickering briefly toward Alexander, who remained at a respectful distance, observing but not intervening, his presence steady, unshaken. "You think this changes everything?" Ethan asked, though the question lacked the authority it once would have carried. Clara's eyes held his, steady, unflinching. "It already has," she said simply. Around them, the room continued to move, but differently now, people no longer orbiting Ethan as they once had, their attention divided, recalculated, shifting toward a new center of gravity that he could no longer control. Vanessa stood a few steps behind, her posture rigid, her expression caught between disbelief and something closer to unease, as if she were beginning to understand that she had stepped into a story whose ending had already been written without her. Ethan glanced back at her, just for a moment, then returned his focus to Clara, as if trying to hold on to something that was slipping faster than he could grasp. "You could have walked away," he said, quieter now, almost searching. Clara's expression softened, but only slightly, not with sentiment, but with clarity. "I did," she answered. "And that is why I am standing here now." The words did not carry anger, did not demand acknowledgement, but they closed something between them with quiet finality. Ethan nodded once, almost imperceptibly, as if acknowledging a truth he could not argue with, even if he did not fully accept it. Clara did not wait for anything more. She did not need a last word, did not need to win the moment, because the moment had already resolved itself the second she stepped into the room. She turned, her movements smooth, assured, and as she walked away, Alexander fell into step beside her, not leading, not following, simply there, aligned, equal. And behind them, under the same chandeliers that had once reflected only one version of success, Ethan Cole stood. In a space that no longer belonged to him, surrounded by the echo of a reality he had never seen coming, realizing too late that the most powerful return is the one that does not ask to be witnessed, because it changes everything whether anyone is ready or not. The night did not end when the applause faded, it unraveled slowly, like a carefully stitched fabric coming apart thread by thread, and for the first time since he had built his name into something people recognized, Ethan Cole felt the weight of a room that no longer moved for him, conversations resuming not around him but around her, subtle shifts in posture, in tone, in attention, all pointing toward a center he could not reclaim. Across the ballroom, Clara moved through the crowd with quiet ease, not stopping to perform, not lingering to bask in what she had already secured, but acknowledging people with a calm nod, a measured glance, the kind of presence that did not seek approval because it no longer depended on it. Beside her, Alexander Reed spoke occasionally, his voice low, his demeanor composed, yet even in his stature, it was clear that tonight was not his introduction, it was her return. Ethan remained near the edge of the stage longer than necessary, his fingers brushing lightly against the polished surface of a nearby table as if grounding himself in something solid, something unchanged, but nothing felt unchanged anymore. Vanessa approached him again, slower this time, her confidence recalibrated into something more cautious, her earlier certainty replaced by a quiet tension she could not fully conceal. "People are talking," she said, her voice controlled, but the edges of it frayed. "You need to fix this." Ethan let out a breath that did not steady him the way it usually would, his gaze drifting once more toward Clara, who now stood in conversation with two board members who had, until recently, answered only to him. "Fix what?" he replied, not sharply, but with a clarity that unsettled even himself. Vanessa blinked, thrown off by the absence of the response she expected. "This," she gestured subtly toward the room, toward the shift that no longer needed explanation. "She just walked in and took everything." Ethan shook his head slightly, the motion small but definitive. "No," he said, his voice quieter now, stripped of the performance that had once defined it. "She did not take anything. It was already hers." The realization settled heavier than anything he had said all night, and for a moment, even Vanessa did not argue. Across the room, Clara's laughter surfaced briefly, soft and unforced, a sound that did not echo with the need to impress, but with something far more grounded, something Ethan recognized too late as authenticity. It was a sound he had not heard in years, not since before everything had become a calculation, a negotiation, a strategy. He watched her as she excused herself from the conversation, her movement fluid, unhurried, and as she stepped toward the balcony doors at the far end of the ballroom, something in him shifted again, not toward reclaiming control, but toward understanding what had been lost long before tonight. Without announcing it, without drawing attention, he followed. The air changed the moment he stepped outside, the cool night breeze cutting through the warmth of the ballroom, carrying with it the distant hum of the city below, steady, indifferent, real. Clara stood near the railing, her hands resting lightly against the smooth stone, her gaze directed outward, toward a skyline that stretched beyond the limits of any single person's influence. She did not turn when he approached. She did not need to. "You always liked this view," he said after a moment, his voice quieter here, less certain, as if the open air stripped away the last of his practiced control. Clara allowed a small pause before responding, not dismissing him, but not inviting him either. "I liked what it represented," she said. "Possibility. Not ownership." Ethan nodded slowly, the distinction landing deeper than he expected. He stepped closer, not enough to intrude, but enough to stand beside her, both of them facing the same horizon, the same distance that had once seemed like something they were building together. "I thought I knew what mattered," he admitted, the words unfamiliar on his tongue, as if they belonged to someone else, someone he had not allowed himself to be. Clara turned her head slightly, her expression calm, her eyes clear, not hardened, not softened, simply certain. "You knew what was visible," she replied. "You just stopped seeing what was real." The city lights flickered below, constant and indifferent, and for a moment, neither of them spoke, the silence between them no longer heavy, but resolved, as if something that had been waiting to be acknowledged had finally found its place. And as the night carried on behind them, inside a ballroom that no longer defined the story, Ethan Cole stood beside the woman he had once underestimated, understanding at last that the most powerful transformations are not the ones you witness in a moment, but the ones you fail to notice until they have already changed everything. The city stretched endlessly beneath them, a grid of light and motion that did not pause for anyone, not for ambition, not for regret, not for realization, and Clara stood there as if she had already made peace with that truth long before tonight ever began. The air carried a quiet chill, brushing against her skin, grounding her in a moment that felt both distant and immediate at the same time, as though the past and present had finally aligned into something she no longer needed to question. Beside her, Ethan remained still, but not composed in the way he once was, his silence now filled with something heavier, something closer to reflection than control. "When did this happen?" he asked after a while, his voice low, stripped of the sharp edges it once carried, as if the question itself was not about timing, but about everything he had failed to notice. Clara did not answer immediately. Her gaze remained on the skyline, on the distant pulse of a world that had continued moving even when hers had fallen apart. "It did not happen all at once," she said finally, her tone calm, measured, but layered with something deeper. It happened the moment I stopped waiting for someone else to see my value. Ethan let the words settle, his brow tightening slightly, not in disagreement, but in recognition of something he could not undo. Inside the ballroom, laughter rose again, softer now, more controlled, as if even the atmosphere had adjusted to a new balance that no longer revolved around him. "You could have told me," he said, though the statement felt weaker the moment it left him. Clara turned her head just enough to look at him, her expression steady, not unkind, but unyielding in its clarity. "Would you have listened?" she asked. The question did not accuse, but it did not need to. Ethan looked away briefly, his gaze dropping toward the street far below, where headlights moved in steady lines, purposeful, uninterrupted. He did not answer, because the truth was already there, unspoken but undeniable. Clara returned her attention to the horizon, her posture relaxed, her presence grounded in a way that did not require explanation. "I used to think being seen was the same as being valued," she continued softly. "But they are not the same thing. Not even close." Ethan exhaled slowly, the sound barely audible, his shoulders lowering just slightly, as if the weight he had been carrying all evening had shifted into something he could no longer ignore. "And now?" he asked. Clara allowed a small pause, not searching for the answer, but choosing it carefully. "Now I know the difference," she said. The simplicity of it left no room for interpretation. Behind them, the balcony doors opened briefly, a soft interruption of warm air and distant voices spilling out before settling again, and for a moment, Ethan considered stepping back inside, returning to the version of himself that had always known what to say, what to do, how to recover. But he did not move. "Not yet. Is there anything left for me in this?" he asked, the question quieter than anything he had said before, almost uncertain, as if he were asking not about the company, not about the room behind them, but about something far less tangible. Clara looked at him fully now, her eyes clear, steady, not searching for something in him, but acknowledging what was already there. "That depends," she replied. "On whether you are asking about what you can take, or what you are willing to understand." The distinction lingered in the air between them, sharper than any argument, more final than any accusation. Ethan nodded once, slowly, as if absorbing something he had never been forced to confront before, and for the first time that night, there was no immediate response, no attempt to reshape the moment into something he could control. Clara turned back toward the city, her focus returning to what lay ahead, not behind, her presence no longer tied to the space they shared, but to something entirely her own. And as the lights below continued to move, steady and indifferent, Ethan Cole stood beside her, no longer at the center of the story, beginning to understand that some losses are not taken from you in a single moment, but revealed to you only after everything has already changed. The night air lingered between them, cool and steady, but something had shifted again, not in the room behind them, not in the city below, but in the space between what had been said and what remained unspoken, and Clara could feel it before Ethan moved, before he straightened slightly as if coming to a decision that did not come easily to a man who had spent years never needing to question himself. "I built everything around certainty," he said after a moment, his voice quieter now, but clearer, as if something in him had settled just enough to allow honesty to surface. "I thought if I controlled enough of it, if I made the right moves, chose the right people, I would never have to look at anything I did not want to face." Clara listened without interrupting, her gaze still directed outward, her posture relaxed, but attentive in a way that did not invite sympathy, only acknowledgement. "And what did you avoid?" she asked, not turning, her tone neutral, but precise. Ethan let out a breath, slower this time, his hands resting lightly against the railing, mirroring her stance without realizing it. "You," he admitted, the word simple, but heavier than anything he had said so far. "What you gave. What you carried. What I dismissed because it did not look like power to me." The admission did not echo, did not draw attention, but it settled between them with a quiet finality that could not be undone. Clara closed her eyes briefly, not in pain, not in relief, but in recognition of a truth that had once taken her years to accept and no longer required validation from anyone else. "You did not dismiss it," she said softly. You just did not understand it. Ethan nodded once, slowly, as if that distinction mattered more than he expected. Behind them, the doors opened again, and this time footsteps approached, measured, unhurried, familiar. Alexander stepped onto the balcony, his presence calm, unobtrusive, yet grounded in a quiet authority that did not compete with the moment but completed it. He did not interrupt. He did not insert himself into the conversation. He simply stood a few feet away, his gaze briefly meeting Clara's, a silent exchange passing between them that required no explanation. Ethan noticed it, of course he did, but for the first time, it did not provoke comparison, did not trigger that instinct to measure, to compete, to assert. It simply existed. He trusts you, Ethan said, his voice thoughtful now, not challenging, not defensive. Clara glanced toward Alexander, a faint softness touching her expression, not performative, not exaggerated, just real. He does not need to, she replied. I trust myself. The difference settled immediately. Alexander stepped closer then, not to stand between them, but beside Clara, aligned in a way that was neither protective nor possessive, just present. They are asking for you inside, he said gently, his voice low, respectful of the moment, but aware of the world that continued moving beyond it. Clara nodded once, her attention returning briefly to the city before shifting back to Ethan, her gaze steady, composed, no longer carrying the weight of unfinished conversations. This is where we end the version of the story you remember, she said, not unkindly, but with clarity that left no space for misinterpretation. Ethan held her gaze, searching perhaps for something more, something unresolved, but there was nothing left to uncover, nothing left to negotiate. And what comes next, he asked, the question quieter now, less about her and more about himself. Clara's expression did not change, but there was something resolute in it, something that had been built piece by piece in silence, far from rooms like this, far from people who only understood value when it was visible. That depends on whether you are ready to build something you cannot control, she said. The words did not linger long, but they remained. Clara turned then, her movement smooth, assured, and as she stepped toward the doors, Alexander matched her pace without effort, the two of them moving forward not as a display, not as a statement, but as something already established, already understood. Ethan remained where he was, the city stretching endlessly in front of him, the ballroom waiting behind him, and for the first time in a very long time, he did not immediately choose either direction, because for the first time, the path forward was not something he could simply decide, it was something he would have to understand. The balcony doors closed softly behind Clara and Alexander, the muted sound sealing off the quiet clarity of the night and returning them to the controlled elegance of the ballroom, but something fundamental had shifted, not in the lighting, not in the music, but in the way people watched, in the way they recalibrated their attention as Clara re-entered the space no longer as a memory, but as a presence that could not be dismissed. Conversations adjusted mid-sentence, subtle nods replaced earlier whispers, and those who once overlooked her now measured their words more carefully, as if aware that influence had quietly changed hands without announcement or spectacle. Clara moved through it all without pause, acknowledging only what mattered, her focus deliberate, her steps unhurried, and beside her, Alexander remained composed, not leading, not overshadowing, simply present in a way that reinforced rather than defined her position. Across the room, Ethan finally stepped back inside, the shift in temperature barely noticeable compared to the shift in reality that met him, and for a moment, he stood just beyond the threshold, observing a space that looked familiar but no longer responded to him in the same way. Vanessa approached him almost immediately, her expression tightened into something sharper, more controlled, but edged with unease that she could not fully conceal. They are already moving, she said quietly, her eyes scanning the room where small groups had begun to form around Clara. Board members. Investors. You cannot just let this happen. Ethan followed her gaze, watching as a man who had once waited outside his office door now leaned in slightly toward Clara, listening, attentive, engaged in a way that felt both subtle and unmistakable. It already happened, Ethan replied, his voice calm, but stripped of the certainty that had once defined it. Vanessa shook her head, frustration rising beneath her composure. Then you push back, she insisted. You make a statement. You remind them who built this. Ethan did not respond immediately. Instead, he continued watching, his attention drawn not to the people surrounding Clara, but to Clara herself, to the way she spoke without rushing, to the way she listened without conceding, to the quiet authority in her posture that did not demand acknowledgement but received it anyway. I built structure, he said finally. She built meaning. The distinction lingered, heavier than anything he had said before, and Vanessa fell silent, not because she agreed, but because she could not immediately argue against it. Across the ballroom, Clara accepted a glass of water from a passing server, her fingers steady, her expression composed, and as one of the senior board members spoke to her with visible respect, she nodded once, not overly agreeable, not distant, simply present, engaged, certain. The man paused mid-sentence, as if recalibrating his own position in the conversation, and Clara responded with a clarity that did not seek approval, only resolution. The exchange was brief, but it carried weight, the kind that signaled a shift not just in ownership, but in direction. Ethan felt it, not as a sudden loss, but as a gradual realization that the influence he had relied on was never as fixed as he believed. It had been conditional. Contextual. Dependent on a narrative he no longer controlled. You are just going to stand here? Vanessa asked again, her voice lower now, more uncertain than demanding. Ethan exhaled slowly, his shoulders settling in a way that felt unfamiliar, as if he were stepping out of something rather than into it. No, he said, not sharply, but with quiet clarity. I am going to watch. And so he did. He watched as Clara continued to move through the room not as someone reclaiming something lost, but as someone stepping fully into something she had already earned. He watched as conversations shifted, as alliances subtly realigned, as recognition replaced assumption. He watched as the version of success he had defined for himself began to look narrower, smaller, less complete than he had ever allowed himself to consider. And as the night carried on, with music rising again and glasses clinking softly under the glow of chandeliers, Ethan Cole stood at the edge of a story that was no longer centered on him, understanding not in a single moment, but in a series of quiet realizations, that the most powerful transformations are not the ones that take something from you, but the ones that reveal what was never truly yours to begin with. The rhythm of the evening resumed, but it was no longer the same rhythm, no longer predictable, no longer centered around the man who had once dictated its pace, and as the music swelled softly through the ballroom, there was a subtle but undeniable shift in how people stood, how they spoke, how they chose where to direct their attention. Clara felt it without needing to look, the way conversations parted slightly as she moved, the way eyes followed not out of curiosity anymore, but out of recognition, and yet she did not slow down, did not lean into it, did not allow the moment to define her, because this was never about the room, never about the approval it could offer. She paused near a long table lined with crystal glasses, her fingers brushing lightly against the rim of one before lifting it, not to drink, but to hold, grounding herself in the present without anchoring herself to it. Alexander stood beside her, his posture relaxed, his presence steady, and when he spoke, it was quiet, almost conversational. They will expect a statement, he said. Clara allowed a faint, almost imperceptible smile to touch her lips. They already have one, she replied. Across the room, Ethan watched, not with the sharp calculation he once carried, but with a kind of stillness that came from seeing something clearly for the first time and realizing there was no immediate way to change it. Vanessa stood beside him, but there was distance now, not physical, but something more subtle, something that had begun the moment certainty left the room. You are letting her define everything, she said, her voice lower now, less demanding, more searching. Ethan shook his head slightly, his gaze never leaving Clara. No, he said quietly. I am finally seeing what was always there. Vanessa followed his line of sight, her expression tightening as she watched Clara speak briefly with another group, her tone calm, her gestures minimal, her authority unmistakable without needing emphasis. And where does that leave you? Vanessa asked. Ethan took a slow breath, the answer not immediate, not rehearsed. That depends on what I do next, he said. The simplicity of it held more weight than any declaration he could have made earlier in the night. Near the center of the ballroom, the host returned once more, attempting to guide the evening back to its original program, but even his voice carried a different tone now, more careful, more aware of the shift that had already taken place. "If we may continue," he announced, though the words felt almost secondary to what had already unfolded. Clara glanced briefly toward the stage, then back to the people in front of her, finishing her conversation without urgency, without interruption, as if she understood that control did not come from commanding attention, but from knowing when it was no longer necessary to compete for it. Ethan stepped forward then, not toward the stage, not toward the center, but into the room itself, moving through it without the usual expectation of recognition, his pace measured, his posture less rigid, as if something in him had recalibrated, not fully, not completely, but enough to change the way he carried himself. A few people acknowledged him as he passed, polite, respectful, but no longer orbiting him in the same way, and he noticed it, of course he did, but for the first time, he did not resist it. He accepted it. Near the far side of the ballroom, he paused, turning back once more, his eyes finding Clara again, not because he needed to confront her, not because he expected anything from her, but because she had become something he could no longer ignore, not as a rival, not as a memory, but as a reality he had failed to understand until now. Clara felt his gaze, just briefly, and when she looked up, their eyes met across the distance, not charged, not unresolved, simply aware. There was no challenge in it. No demand. Just acknowledgement. And then, almost in the same moment, Clara turned away, her attention returning to what lay ahead, to conversations that would shape the next chapter, to decisions that no longer required permission. Ethan watched for a second longer, then let out a quiet breath, not heavy, not defeated, but changed, and as the night continued around him, with music rising and voices blending under the glow of chandeliers, he understood something that no one had needed to say out loud. This was no longer about what he had lost. It was about what he had never truly built in the first place. The evening had settled into something quieter now, not in volume, but in tone, as if the room itself had accepted a truth it could no longer ignore, and Clara stood at the center of that shift without ever claiming it, her presence steady, her movements intentional, her voice measured as she spoke with a group of senior executives whose attention remained fixed on her, not out of obligation, but out of recognition. The chandeliers above cast a soft glow across the polished marble, reflecting fragments of conversations that no longer carried the same assumptions as before, and in those reflections, the story of the night had already changed. Direction. Clara listened more than she spoke, her gaze attentive, her responses precise, never rushed, never excessive, each word placed with quiet certainty, as if she had learned long ago that power did not need to fill silence, it only needed to understand it. Alexander stood nearby, his posture relaxed, his attention observant, stepping in only when necessary, and even then, his presence complemented hers rather than overshadowed it, a balance that did not go unnoticed by those watching closely. Across the room, Ethan moved differently now, no longer tracing the same paths he had walked earlier, no longer expecting the room to adjust around him, but navigating it as it was, acknowledging its new center without resistance. A few familiar faces greeted him, their expressions polite, their tone respectful, but the difference was there, subtle but unmistakable, and he did not challenge it. He absorbed it. Near one of the quieter corners of the ballroom, he paused beside a tall window, the glass reflecting both the city lights outside and the room behind him, merging two worlds into one layered image that felt strangely fitting. He watched Clara through that reflection, not directly, but through the distortion of distance and light, as if seeing her from a perspective he had never allowed himself before. Vanessa approached again, slower this time, her confidence no longer sharp, but carefully held together, as if she were adjusting to a reality she had not anticipated. "They are already repositioning," she said quietly, her voice controlled, but lacking the certainty it once carried. "You can still influence this if you act now." Ethan remained still for a moment, his eyes still on the reflection, on the way Clara moved through the room with a presence that did not demand control, but created it. "Influence what?" he asked, his tone calm, not dismissive, but grounded in a clarity that had not been there before. Vanessa hesitated, just slightly. The outcome, she replied. Ethan turned his head then, looking at her fully, not with frustration, not with impatience, but with something closer to understanding. The outcome already changed, he said. I just did not see it happening. The words landed between them, not harsh, but final enough to quiet any immediate response. Vanessa looked away briefly, her gaze drifting toward Clara, toward the conversations forming around her, toward the subtle shift in how people align themselves. Without needing instruction. She did not argue this time. She could not. Back near the center of the room, Clara concluded another conversation, her tone softening slightly as she nodded, acknowledging a point before stepping back, creating space without withdrawing, maintaining presence without holding attention longer than necessary. It was a rhythm, one she had built over time, one that did not rely on performance, but on understanding when to move and when to remain still. As she turned, her eyes met Ethan's reflection in the glass, not directly, but enough to register, enough to acknowledge without reopening anything that had already found its conclusion. There was no tension in it. No question. Just awareness. Ethan held that moment for a second, then let it pass, not chasing it, not interpreting it, simply allowing it to exist as it was. Around them, the evening continued, awards being presented, names being announced, applause rising and falling in waves that now felt secondary to what had already taken place. And as Clara stepped forward once more into the flow of the night, her path clear, her presence grounded, the room no longer shaped her, it responded to her, while Ethan Cole stood at the edge of a reflection that showed him something he had never truly seen before, not just who she had become, but who she had always been, and in that quiet realization, something in him shifted not toward reclaiming what was lost, but toward understanding what had never been his to define. By the time the final award of the evening was announced, the room had fully settled into its new alignment, not through force, not through spectacle, but through a quiet, undeniable recognition that something fundamental had shifted, and Clara stood within it not as a disruption, but as its natural center, her presence no longer questioned, no longer compared, simply accepted. The applause rose again, measured and respectful, but even as the recipients stepped forward to accept their recognition, there was a subtle awareness that the true defining moment of the night had already passed, and it had not come with a trophy, but with a revelation. Clara remained composed, her hands resting lightly at her sides, her gaze steady as she acknowledged those around her, each interaction brief, intentional, and complete, never lingering beyond what was necessary, never extending into performance. Alexander stood beside her, his posture unchanged, his attention attuned not to the room's approval, but to her rhythm, stepping in only when needed, offering presence without overshadowing, a balance that now felt less like a partnership of convenience and more like a shared understanding that required no explanation. Across the ballroom, Ethan had stopped moving altogether, not out of uncertainty, but out of a growing awareness that motion alone would not restore what had shifted, and as he stood there, watching the final moments of the evening unfold, he realized that what he had once defined as control had always been temporary, dependent on perception, sustained by assumption. Vanessa lingered nearby, but her silence now carried more weight than her earlier words, her posture less rigid, her gaze more distant, as if she, too, was recalculating a narrative she had believed was fixed. "So this is it?" she asked quietly, not looking at him, but at the room, at the subtle realignment of attention that no longer included them in the same way. Ethan did not answer immediately. Instead, he let the question settle, turning it over not as a challenge, but as something to be understood. "No," he said finally, his voice calm, stripped of urgency. "This is just where I start seeing it clearly." Vanessa glanced at him then, searching for something familiar, something that matched the man she had aligned herself with, but what she found instead was something quieter, less predictable, and she did not respond. Near the center of the room, Clara turned slightly as the applause faded once more, her gaze moving across the space not to measure it, but to close it, to acknowledge that this chapter, this setting, had reached its natural conclusion. She did not need to stay longer. She did not need to reinforce what had already been established. "Are you ready?" Alexander asked softly, his voice low, steady. Clara nodded once, her expression calm, her focus already shifting beyond the ballroom, beyond the night, toward what came next. Together, they began to move toward the exit, not hurried, not delayed, their pace aligned, their presence leaving a subtle wake of awareness as people stepped aside without being asked, not out of obligation, but out of recognition. Ethan saw them, of course he did, his gaze following not with urgency, not with regret, but with a quiet understanding that this was not something he could call back, not something he could reshape with words or timing. Clara did not look back. She did not need to. The doors opened, the cool night air slipping in once more, and as she stepped through, the light from the ballroom faded behind her, not dramatically, not symbolically, but simply as a natural transition from one space to another. And in that moment, as the doors closed softly behind her, Ethan Cole remained standing under the same chandeliers that had once defined his world, realizing not with shock, not with anger, but with a clarity that settled deeper than either, that the most profound endings are not marked by loss, but by the quiet certainty that something has already moved beyond you, and there is nothing left to hold on to except the truth you can no longer ignore. The night outside was quieter than the one she had just left behind, but it carried something the ballroom never could, something unfiltered, something real, and as Clara stepped onto the sidewalk beneath the soft glow of the streetlights, the distant hum of the city wrapped around her like a steady rhythm that did not need applause to exist. The air was cooler here, lighter, and she let out a slow breath she had not realized she had been holding, her shoulders relaxing just slightly, not from exhaustion, but from completion. Behind her, the heavy doors of the hotel remained closed, sealing in a world that had once defined her, a world she no longer needed to enter to understand her own worth. Alexander walked beside her, his pace matched to hers without effort, his presence quiet, grounded, not asking for anything, not filling the silence, simply there in a way that felt certain. "You did not stay long," he said after a moment, his voice calm, almost reflective. Clara allowed a faint smile, not directed at him, but at the thought itself. "I stayed exactly as long as I needed to," she replied. The words carried no hesitation, no second-guessing, only clarity. They reached the waiting car, its polished surface reflecting the city lights in soft, shifting patterns, and for a moment, Clara paused before stepping in, her gaze lifting toward the skyline, toward the same horizon she had looked at from the balcony, but now without the weight of anything behind her. It was different out here. Not because the city had changed, but because she had. Inside the ballroom, under the chandeliers and measured conversations, everything had been about perception, about roles, about narratives people chose to believe. Out here, there was no audience. No expectation. Just forward movement. Alexander opened the door for her, but did not rush her, did not guide her, allowing her that final second of stillness, of reflection that did not pull her backward, but grounded her fully in the present. "No regrets?" he asked, not as a test, not as a challenge, but as a quiet acknowledgement of everything that had led to this moment. Clara shook her head once, her expression calm, her eyes clear. "No," she said simply. "Because I did not come back to prove anything." She stepped into the car then, settling into the seat with a quiet ease, the soft interior light brushing against her features, highlighting not triumph, not relief, but something steadier, something deeper. Peace. Alexander joined her a moment later, the door closing with a soft, final sound that separated them from the night outside, and as the car began to move, the city slipping past in a blur of light and motion, Clara leaned back slightly, her gaze drifting forward, not toward what had been, but toward what was already unfolding ahead. Inside the hotel, far above, under the fading glow of chandeliers, Ethan Cole remained where the night had left him, surrounded by conversations that no longer needed his direction, by a world that continued without waiting for him to understand it, and for the first time, he did not try to step back into it the way he once would have. He stood still, not lost, not defeated, but aware, in a way that could not be undone. Outside, the car turned onto a broader avenue, the skyline opening up ahead, vast, illuminated, full of possibilities that did not belong to anyone, but could be claimed by those who understood their own place within it. Clara watched it all without urgency, her hands resting lightly in her lap, her breath steady, her presence fully her own. She had not come back to take revenge. She had not come back to be seen. She had simply come back as someone who no longer needed either. And as the city carried her forward into a future that did not depend on anyone else's recognition, the truth settled quietly, completely, without the need for confirmation. She did not seek revenge. She became it.